Good morning. It's Robert again. Robert Boutner. Yesterday, I began, and I thought about when I talked about autism. I've read titles, because it's hard for me to read, that there are gifts and gaps. And I thought, okay, yeah, there are gifts and gaps in the mind of autistic people, but aren't there gifts and gaps in all of us? Why are autistic people separated out? So I decided to think about and talk more about the law of innocence, since I brought that up yesterday, which I'll read again in a moment, because I thought, well, I'll just say I wrote a book. I didn't know that I could write, and I couldn't, but I had to teach myself how to write at a older age, like 55-ish. So so I started writing. It took me 2.5 years to write my book, and it's taken another 1.5 years to edit the book. I'm still in the process, but I getting ahead of myself. I was in a group of people, and somebody asked the question, well, who are the most vulnerable people around us? And there were a number of answers to that question. And one of the answers somebody said was that, well, children, and others said it was babies. And the lady who posed that question said, how about the incarcerated? It's like, wow, that always impressed me, that the incarcerated were the most vulnerable. When babies need their attention or want attention, they cry. And people usually give them that attention. And she was right. At least I believe she was right. Well, to be able to talk about the law of innocence and how I survived my upbringing was, I was in a perpetual state of innocence. I needed to be. And I didn't realize that I was in that state of innocence, which is why I denied that I had any form of autism in me at all. And in fact, while I wrote my entire book, I kept trying to prove that I don't have autism, only to get to a point where I decided I did have autism, because I had to have something that helped me survive. So once I got to my last chapter, I realized, even if it was the most mild form of autism, I realized it did help me survive. And that's one of the reasons I wrote The Law of Innocence. In any case, before I get into rereading that, I'll tell you what, I'll reread it and then we're gonna go feed the animals, because it's time to feed. But I'll read it to you in a second. Born in innocence, and then it gets diluted along the way of life, and maybe it even gets diluted in the womb. This journey of writing, which I never thought in my wildest dreams or imagination that I'd ever become a writer, would teach me so much. So if there was a suggestion, write the first 10 years of your life. And I think it'll answer a lot of behavioral questions as to why you do what you do. That's what I learned. Anyway, I'll go back to feeding. What I didn't know when I started writing. I write, I think, the first almost 18 chapters of my book before I hit 10 years old. 10 years old was a very pivotal moment in my life. That was my first attempt at suicide, and some very major decisions that I made, other decisions I'll share down the road. But that was a very pivotal moment. Maybe one that was maybe not equal to that moment, but I didn't talk for the first 4.5 years of life. I was a mute, kind of like being in a cocoon, but those 4.5 years of silence served me based on the environment that I was in. Back in the 60s, they just viewed me as retarded, which I was told, my brothers thought I was retarded. Referred to me as a MR. My first word that I spoke was interpreted as googie. 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 That then became my nickname, Googie. It didn't take me long to learn how to talk. Then when I started talking, Mother couldn't wait for me to shut up. Well, that was okay. Like I said, those 4.5 years served me in the environment I grew up in. Eventually asked my autism therapist, well, do I have autism or do I have trauma? And her reply was, you have both. Like, okay. All right, I have both. So it's like, I didn't know what to do with that piece of information. I realized that one of the reasons why I came to the conclusion that it was okay for me to accept the diagnosis, there was a lady who said to me, if you don't accept the diagnosis, how are you supposed to help somebody who has it if you're not willing to own it? And that made sense to me. Like, okay, I can understand that. So it's still hard to own it because I haven't been one to label myself with labels. I mean, Mr. is a label, so my name is a label, so there's parts of that that are true and parts of that that are not true. Autism was one I was not willing to accept, and I think I didn't want to accept it because it was a representation in my mind confirming from my experiences growing up that I was broken. And who wants to be broken? I didn't want to validate being broken. And it does take a mind shift. And it took a while as it's sits in my head that autism is a gift. So I oversee about 40 to 45 horses at any given moment throughout the day. Right now it's probably 43. There's a lot of people who own horses who wish they had a horse boarding facility, but they're the ones that own the horse. And I don't own a horse. I actually have no interest in owning a horse. I like horses, but I'm not interested in owning one. So I used funny bow. One of the decisions I decided when I was 10 years old was that I would be a carpenter. And I stared at homes and how they how they were put together, how floor joists were constructed, and how wiring and electrical were all connected. And that paid off because I put this facility together with all the electricity, even though I didn't understand how it all worked. It paid off for me.